It was a calm afternoon in the small city, the kind of day that felt quiet even when cars moved by. The air was clear, the sun gentle. An old man sat behind the wheel of his car, driving slowly down a familiar road. His hands rested softly on the steering wheel, his posture straight, his movements careful. Everything about him spoke of patience. He had just left the cemetery where he went every Sunday to visit his late wife's grave. It was his habit for years: bring fresh flowers, talk to her for a few minutes, then drive home before sunset. The radio played softly beside him, an old jazz tune that filled the car with a warm hum. His car was old but clean and well cared for. He didn't rush anywhere anymore. At his age, he had learned that peace was found in slow moments. He stopped at every sign, checked his mirrors twice, and smiled when a child waved from the sidewalk. He was only 10 minutes from home when a police car pulled out from a side street behind him. The flashing lights blinked once, then again. The old man, weeks passed since that long conversation between the young officer and the old man. The sound of breaking glass had faded from his mind, but the weight of that moment never truly left. Every time he looked at his patrol car window, he remembered how fragile both glass and trust could be. He began to move through his days differently. When he pulled someone over, he took a deep breath before stepping out of the car. He reminded himself that the person he was approaching was just that, a person, someone's parent, child, neighbor, or friend. His partner noticed the change too. "You've been acting different lately," he said one morning while they sat in the patrol car. "Just trying to listen more," the young officer replied quietly. "To who?" "To everyone," he said, looking out the window. "People have things to say if you just stop long enough to hear them." The partner didn't respond right away. He just nodded, maybe a little confused, maybe a little curious. One day their unit was sent to a neighborhood known for tension with the police. It wasn't a bad area, just one where people didn't trust uniforms anymore. The young officer understood why. He'd seen that fear in people's eyes before, and now he knew how it felt from the other side. As they rolled down the street, they saw a small group of kids playing basketball. The ball bounced out into the road and rolled toward the car. The officer stopped, stepped out, and picked it up. One of the boys froze, uncertain. The officer smiled and tossed the ball back. "Good shot, kid," he said. The boy smiled slowly, and the game continued. It was a small thing, but the officer felt something shift inside him. He realized that trust wasn't earned through speeches or policies. It grew one small moment at a time. Later that week, the chief called him into the office again. The young officer felt nervous, but the chief's tone was calm. "My father told me you've been making an effort," the chief said. "I'm trying." "Sir," the officer replied. "I see that," the chief said, leaning back in his chair. "He told me you listened, really listened." "You know how rare that is in our line of work?" The officer shrugged slightly. "I guess I didn't know how much I wasn't listening before." The chief gave a faint smile. "Most of us don't. My father wants to start something in community meetings between officers and residents. He asked if you'd be part of it." The officer blinked in surprise. "Me, after everything that happened?" "Especially because of that," the chief said. "People will listen to you now not because you were perfect, but because you weren't. You've seen both sides. You can help others understand." The officer felt a mix of pride and nervousness. "I'll do it, sir." The first meeting took place in a local community center. The air smelled of old wood and coffee. Chairs were set up in a circle, no podiums, no microphones. Just people. Residents came in slowly, some skeptical, some curious. The officer sat quietly, waiting his turn to speak. When it finally came, he stood and looked around the room. "I made a mistake," he said simply. "A big one. I let fear decide how I treated someone. It cost me more than I expected, not my job, but my peace. I can't take it back, but I can learn from it." The room was silent for a moment. Then an older woman nodded. "At least you can admit it," she said softly. "That's more than most," the officer nodded. "I think that's where we start, admitting we don't always get it right. I'm here to listen and not defend." That meeting ran for hours. People spoke about their experiences: frustration, fear, hope, and exhaustion. Some cried, some argued. But for the first time, it felt like both sides were actually hearing each other. Afterward, the old man, the chief's father, approached him with a smile. "You did well," he said quietly. "That's what change looks like." "I just told the truth," the officer said. That's all it takes, the old man replied. Truth grows roots when spoken from the heart. In the following months, more meetings were held. More officers joined. Slowly, things began to shift. Not dramatically, but gently, like snow melting in spring. People started greeting officers on the street again. Some even waved. One evening, the young officer drove past a small diner and noticed the old man sitting alone inside. He parked and went in. Mind if I join you? He asked. The old man smiled. Please do. They ordered coffee and sat in comfortable silence for a while. You ever get tired? The officer asked finally. All the time, the old man said with a chuckle. But tiredness isn't the same as giving up. It's just a sign you've been trying. The officer nodded. I think I used to believe strength meant being tough all the time. But it's not that. It's staying gentle when you have every reason not to be. Months went by and the city began to feel a little different. The chief noticed it first. The calls were still coming in, the shifts were still long, and the world was still far from perfect. But there was something new in the air. Something gentler. The changes hadn't come from any big speech or press release. They'd come quietly, from small acts that added up. Officers were greeting people more often, listening before reacting, and showing up to community events not because they had to, but because they wanted to. It wasn't easy, though. Some didn't like the change. They said it made them look weak, that people would take advantage of kindness. The chief would listen patiently and then say, kindness isn't weakness, it's control. The young officer who had once smashed a window now led by example. He was still the same person, but his heart felt lighter, his purpose clearer. One afternoon, the chief called him into his office again. There was a file open on the desk and a familiar picture, the old man's photo from years ago. You've been doing good work, the chief said, tapping the folder. The community meetings, the outreach programs, people are noticing. Thank you, sir, the officer said. I'm putting you in charge of the new mentorship program, the chief continued. For younger officers, I want them to see what you've learned firsthand. The officer blinked in surprise. Are you sure? I am, the chief said. If my father can see something in you, that's good enough for me. The officer smiled quietly. I'll do my best. That evening, he stopped by the old man's house again. The porch light was on and the faint sound of a radio played an old tune from inside. The old man opened the door, smiling. I was just thinking about you, he said. The officer laughed softly. Seems like you always know. Come in, the old man said, leading him to the living room. They sat down and the officer told him about the mentorship program. I'm nervous, he admitted. I'm not sure I'm the right person for it. The old man sipped his tea. You're exactly the right person, he said. The best teachers aren't the ones who never made mistakes. They're the ones who learned from them. The officer looked thoughtful. I don't want to preach to them. I just want them to understand what it means to treat people like people. Then don't preach, the old man said. Show them. That's all you need to do, the officer nodded slowly. You make it sound so simple. It is simple, the old man said with a gentle smile. It's just not easy. The mentorship program started small, just 6 young recruits and the officer. They met in a small training room once a week. He didn't talk about procedures or rules. He talked about perspective. He told them about the time he acted out of fear and what it taught him about himself. He didn't mention names or details. He just spoke from the heart. At first, the recruits were quiet. They weren't used to hearing stories like that from a senior officer. But slowly they began to open up too. They talked about their own fears, of making mistakes, of not being respected, of being misunderstood. The officer listened, just like the old man had listened to him. And little by little, something changed in that room. It became a space not of authority, but of understanding. One day after class, a young recruit stayed behind. Sir, he said, I want to thank you. I joined this job thinking it was about being tough. But I think I get it now. It's about being steady. The officer smiled. That's a good word, steady. He walked out of the building that day feeling proud. Not the kind of pride that shouted, but the kind that settled quietly in the heart. Meanwhile, the chief was busy too. He worked with the city to build stronger connections between officers and neighborhoods. He set up open-door hours at the precinct, invited local leaders to speak, and created new training sessions about communication and empathy. Some officers grumbled at first, but when they saw the results, fewer complaints, calmer calls, and genuine smiles from the people they served. The resistance sight began to fade. The old man watched all of this from a distance. He never asked for credit or attention. Time moved forward quietly, as it always does. Seasons changed, people came and went, but the lessons from that single moment years ago, the sound of a shattering car window, remained alive in the hearts of those who had lived it. The city had grown calmer, not perfect, but different. The police department had become more open. Community meetings were no longer tense gatherings, but honest conversations. The officers who once saw citizens as cases now saw them as neighbors. The young officer, now older and wiser, had become one of the most respected people in the department. He never bragged about his work or his past. Instead, he focused on listening. Whenever new recruits arrived, he would take them for a walk through the streets, not to show power, but to remind them of purpose. "Every street has a story," he would say softly. "Every face you see is carrying something you don't know. Don't be the reason someone loses hope." He had learned that from an old man, the one whose forgiveness had changed his life forever. The old man still lived in the same little house at the end of the quiet street. His garden had grown wild and full, just the way he liked it. Every week the officer stopped by to visit. They didn't always talk about the past. Sometimes they talked about the weather, or about the chief's latest community project, or about life in general. The old man had grown slower with age, but his voice still carried strength. His laughter filled the room whenever the officer shared stories about the young recruits. "You're turning into quite the teacher," he would tease. "Not like you," the officer would reply with a grin. "Maybe," the old man would chuckle. "But we both learned the same way, by living." One afternoon, the chief joined them for tea. It had become something of a tradition now, the three of them sitting together, not as a chief, an officer, and a citizen, but simply as men who had walked through misunderstanding and come out the other side. The chief looked around the cozy living room, the sunlight spilling through the curtains. "You know," he said, "this house has seen more change in this city than any other building I can think of." The old man smiled. "Not the house, son. The people." The three of them laughed softly. It was a warm sound, full of gratitude and peace. But life has a way of testing people, even when they think the hard part is over. One morning, the department received a call about a tense situation downtown, a misunderstanding that was escalating fast. A young officer had pulled over a driver, and the situation was growing heated. The young man in the car felt disrespected, and the officer, feeling defensive, began raising his voice. When the older officer heard about it over the radio, his heart tightened. He could almost feel the air of that day years ago, the one that had changed everything. Without hesitation, he drove to the scene. When he arrived, he saw the tension in the air like static. The young officer stood rigid, his hand near his belt, while the driver looked frightened and angry. The older officer stepped between them. "Take a breath," he said calmly to the young officer. "Sir, take a breath," the older officer repeated, his tone steady but gentle. The young officer hesitated, then slowly lowered his hand. The driver's shoulders dropped, the fear easing from his face. "Let's all calm down," the older officer said. "Nobody hears the enemy. Let's just talk." It took a few minutes, but the storm began to pass. The driver explained that he hadn't heard the siren because of loud music. The officer explained that he had thought the driver was ignoring him on purpose. When they finally understood each other, they shook hands. The young officer looked at his mentor afterward. "How did you know what to do?" he asked quietly. The older man smiled faintly. "Because I've been both of you." That night, when he stopped by the old man's house, he told him the story. The old man listened with that familiar, quiet pride. "You stopped a fire before it began," the old man said. "That's what peace really is. It's choosing calm when you have every reason not to." The officer nodded slowly. "I think I finally understand what you meant back then. About forgiveness freeing people." The old man smiled. "It frees both sides." The chief arrived a little later with a small box in his hands. "I've got something for you," he said. Placing it on the table, the officer opened it and found a medal inside, a recognition for his years of service and his work in community reform. "I don't need this," the officer said softly. "I know," the chief replied, smiling, "but you deserve it." My father was right about you, the old man chuckled. Well, I've been right a few times in my life. They all laughed again. A few months later, the old man's health began to fade. Age had finally caught up to him, as it does with everyone. The officer visited more often, helping around the house, reading to him, and just sitting quietly beside him when words weren't needed. One evening, as the sun dipped low and the air turned golden, the old man looked over at the officer and said softly, "You know, that day when you broke that window, I thought my world was falling apart. But it was just beginning to change. You were meant to find your way here, to learn, to teach. That's how life works. Pain becomes purpose." The officer swallowed hard. "You changed me. You made me better," the old man smiled. "We changed each other. That's what understanding does." Those were some of the last words the old man ever spoke. He passed away peacefully a few days later, surrounded by those who loved him most. At the funeral, the entire community came together. Officers stood beside citizens, not in separation, but in unity. The chief gave a short speech, his voice trembling slightly. "My father believed in people," he said, "even when they failed, even when they made mistakes. He believed that no one is too far gone to change. He taught me that leadership isn't about control, it's about compassion. And because of him, our city is learning to heal." After the service, the officer stood by the graveside long after everyone had gone. The sky was quiet, the air heavy with both sadness and gratitude. He placed his hand on the headstone and whispered, "Thank you." When he returned to the precinct the next week, things felt different. The old man's words echoed in every corner of the building. Officers spoke more softly. People carried themselves with quiet pride. The chief called a meeting and announced that they would be creating a new community initiative in the old man's honor. It would focus on empathy training, communication, and building trust between officers and citizens. They called it the Bridge Project. When they unveiled the plaque, it read, "In memory of a man whose forgiveness turned anger into understanding and whose wisdom turned pain into purpose." Years later, whenever the officer walked past that plaque, he would touch it lightly, a reminder of how far they had come. The city continued to grow. New recruits joined, eager and hopeful. Some had never even heard the full story of the shattered window, but they felt its impact in the culture around them, in the way officers spoke, in the way they listened. One evening, a young recruit approached the now senior officer and said, "Sir, I've heard stories about how things used to be. Do you think people can really change?" The officer looked at him, his eyes calm and kind. "People don't just change," he said. "They grow. And growth takes mistakes, time, and forgiveness from others. And from ourselves." The recruit nodded slowly, as if he understood something deeper than the words. The officer looked out through the station window. The sunset glowed across the city skyline, the same city where everything had started. He thought of the old man, of the chief, of every moment that had brought them here. And for the first time in a long time, he felt a deep peace, a quiet certainty that even in a world full of mistakes and misunderstandings, Gray still had the power to rebuild what anger had once broken. He smiled to himself and whispered, "We did it. You were right." Then he turned back to the busy precinct where laughter, chatter, and the sounds of a city in motion filled the air. It was a place still learning, still growing, but no longer divided. Because once upon a time, a single act of forgiveness had opened a door no one knew was locked. And from that day on, the light never stopped shining through, on. He simply watched the slow, steady change and felt grateful. One morning, the chief visited his father at home. He brought coffee and a small notebook. "What's that?" his father asked, smiling. "Something I've been writing," the chief said. "Lessons you've taught me and others. I want to use them in our department training." The old man's eyes softened. "You don't need a book for that. You just need people willing to listen." "I know," the chief said, smiling. "But I want something to remind them. Something to last." The old man nodded approvingly. "Then write it down. But make sure the last line says this: change starts in one heart at a time." The chief wrote it down, his pen steady, his eyes warm. A few days later, the department hosted a public event, Community and Unity Day. The goal was to bring officers and citizens together outside of uniforms and duty. There were food stalls, music, laughter, and open conversations. The old man attended, walking slowly with his cane. The officer was there too, helping organize the event. When he saw the old man arrive, he hurried over and greeted him with a warm smile. "You made it," the officer said. "Wouldn't miss it," the old man replied. The chief joined them a moment later. "I think this might be the first time in years I've seen everyone smiling here," he said. His father chuckled. "That's B." As the sun began to set, the chief invited the old man to say a few words. The crowd fell silent as he took the small stage. His voice was steady and calm, carrying both age and strength. "I've lived long enough to know that mistakes don't define us," he said. "What defines us is how we respond after the mistake. Forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's freeing. It allows space for better things to grow. I've seen my son grow into a fair leader. I've seen officers learn humility. And I've seen this community start to believe again. That's all I ever wanted." The crowd clapped softly, not out of formality, but from the heart. The officer felt his throat tighten. That simple speech carried more truth than 100 policies ever could. After the event, as the crowd slowly left, the officer walked the old man to his car. "You know," the old man said, "I used to think my time for change was done, but maybe it's never done. Maybe it keeps going through people who keep learning." The officer nodded. "You've changed me more than you'll ever know." The old man smiled. "Then my job here is done." But deep down, both of them knew that change never really ended. It just kept moving from one heart to another, like ripples in water. That night, the chief stood in his office, looking out at the city lights. He thought of his father's words, his officer's growth, and the quiet strength that came from humility. He knew there would still be hard days ahead. There always were. But now, there was also hope. He picked up the small notebook again and added one final line beneath his father's quote. "Forgiveness doesn't erase what happened. It builds a bridge strong enough to carry us forward." He closed the notebook and smiled. Somewhere out there, the young officer was mentoring another group. Somewhere else, the old man was probably reading by his window, sipping tea, feeling at peace. And for the first time in a long while, the chief felt at peace too. The city was still the same on the surface, the same streets, the same lights, but something deep within it had changed. A broken window had once caused pain, but now it had become a doorway to understanding. And as the night fell quietly over the city, 3 men, a father, a son, and an officer, carried that lesson in their hearts, knowing that sometimes the smallest cracks can let the brightest light through. The old man's eyes softened. "Now you're learning." They sat a while longer, talking about life. Not the past, not the window, just life. When the officer left, he realized how much lighter he felt. Forgiveness had done something punishment never could. It had given him purpose. At the station, the chief was working late. The officer stopped by his office. "I saw your father tonight," he said. The chief looked up and smiled faintly. "He said you'd stop by." "You two talk often?" "Almost every night," the chief said. "He likes to remind me that patience is a better teacher than pride." The officer laughed softly. "Sounds like him." The chief grew thoughtful. "You know, when this all happened, I was angry. Not just at you, but at the whole situation. I wanted to make an example out of it, but he stopped me. He said, if you punish him, he'll remember the pain. If you guide him, he'll remember the lesson." He was right. The officer lowered his eyes. "I'm grateful for that chance." The chief nodded. "So am I. Maybe we both learned something we didn't know we needed." From that day on, the young officer became a quiet example in the department. He didn't preach or boast. He just lived differently. When tempers flared, he was the one who spoke calmly. When younger officers acted rashly, he was the one who reminded them to slow down. One morning, a rookie asked him, "How do you stay so calm when people yell at you out there?" The officer smiled faintly. "Because I've been on both sides of the glass." The rookie frowned, not understanding. The older officer didn't explain. He just smiled again. Some lessons didn't need words. Weeks later, the department hosted another community event, this time organized by both the chief and his father. Families came, kids played, and for once laughter filled the air where tension used to live. The officer helped set up tables, shook hands, and listened to stories. At one point, the old man stood beside him, watching the children run around. "You see that?" he said. "This is what it's supposed to be, people seeing each other as people again." The officer nodded. "It's beautiful. It's fragile, too," the old man said softly. "That's why you have to protect it, not with force, but with care." As the sun set, the old man got ready to leave. Before he did, he placed a hand on the officer's shoulder. "You've come far," he said, "but never forget, understanding is a journey, not a destination." The officer smiled. "I'll remember that." That night he drove home feeling proud. Not the kind of pride that comes from medals or promotions, but the quiet pride that comes from doing right when no one's watching. He parked his car and looked at the reflection in his side mirror. A man changed not by rules, but by wisdom. For the first time since that terrible day, he didn't feel haunted by the sound of breaking glass. He felt grateful for it, because that moment, as painful as it was, had opened a door to something greater: understanding, compassion, and humility. He had broken a window once, but now every day he worked to build windows between hearts, clear enough for people to see one another again. And somewhere across town, the old man sat by his window sipping tea, watching the evening sky fade to gold. He smiled softly, knowing that sometimes even the hardest lessons can grow the strongest peace, answered in the rearview mirror. He wasn't speeding. He wasn't doing anything wrong. Still, he signaled carefully and pulled over to the curb. Inside the patrol car, a young officer sat stiffly, gripping the wheel too tightly. He was new to the job, eager to prove himself, sometimes too eager. He had seen the small crack on the back tail light of the old man's car and decided to pull him over. In his mind, it was just another stop, another box to check off for the day. As the officer approached, the old man rolled his window halfway down. It creaked. The old mechanism stuck sometimes. He smiled politely. "Afternoon, officer," he said, his voice gentle and tired. The officer's tone was sharp, practiced. "License and registration, please." The next morning, the station felt different. The usual noise, phones ringing, printers humming, footsteps on tile, all seemed quieter. Every officer knew what had happened the day before, though no one said it out loud. The story had spread fast, carried through whispers, short glances, and half-finished sentences. The young officer who had smashed the window sat at his desk, staring at his paperwork. His uniform looked pressed, but his eyes were tired. He hadn't slept. All night his mind replayed the sound of breaking glass and the look on the old man's face. Calm, forgiving, steady. The more he thought about it, the worse he felt. He didn't mean to hurt anyone. He just thought he was doing his job. But now he realized that doing a job isn't the same as doing what's right. The chief came in later than usual. He didn't stop to chat like he sometimes did. He went straight to his office, shut the door, and sat for a long time in silence. On his desk was a small photo of his father taken years ago, standing proudly at his wife's birthday, a gentle smile on his face. Looking at it now, the chief felt a deep ache in his chest. He couldn't believe his father had been treated that way, by one of his own men. But what hurt more was knowing his father wasn't angry. That quiet forgiveness made the whole thing heavier. It showed the chief how much wisdom and patience it took to face injustice without hate. After a while, the chief called the young officer into his office. The officer walked in nervously, standing stiff as a post. "Sit down," the chief said quietly. The young man sat, keeping his eyes low. "I'm not here to yell at you," the chief began. "I just want to understand what went through your mind yesterday." The young officer swallowed hard. "I thought he was ignoring my command, sir. He didn't roll the window all the way down. I thought he might be hiding something." The chief nodded slowly. "So you broke his window?" The officer winced at the words. "Yes, sir." "Did you feel threatened?" "No, sir, I was just unsure." "That's honest," the chief said, leaning back. But uncertainty isn't danger. Fear isn't always a reason to act. You have to learn the difference. The young man nodded, his throat tight. I know, sir. I should have handled it differently. The chief's voice softened. My father isn't going to press charges. He believes you can learn from this. I hope he's right. The officer looked up, surprised. He's not pressing charges. No, the chief said. He says people only change when they understand what they did wrong, not when they're punished for it. The officer blinked. He couldn't understand how someone he'd treated so roughly could be that forgiving. The chief continued. You'll still face review from the board, but I want you to meet with my father. He asked for it. The officer's heart skipped. He wants to meet me? Yes. Today, if possible. He said he has something to tell you. The officer's stomach turned with nerves. He didn't want to face the man whose window he'd smashed, but deep down he knew he had to. A few hours later, he stood outside a small house on a quiet street. It was neat and simple. Flowers. By the porch, a flag on the post, wind chimes that sang softly in the breeze. He hesitated before knocking. Then the door opened. The old man stood there wearing a sweater and a calm expression. Come in, son, he said gently. The officer stepped inside, unsure where to look. The living room was cozy, filled with books, framed photos, and the F. 'Cause they're remembering they're all on the same side. Ain't smell of coffee. Sit down, the old man said, motioning toward a chair. Sir, before anything, I'm sorry, the officer blurted out. I shouldn't have done what I did. I was nervous and... The old man raised a hand, stopping him. I know, sit first. Let's talk. The officer sat, fidgeting. The old man poured him a cup of coffee and sat across from him. You've been through a lot these past few days, haven't you? The old man asked. Yes, sir. The old man smiled faintly. So have I, but that's life. It gives us moments we don't expect, and then asks what we learned from them. The officer didn't know what to say. He just nodded slowly. I've seen more of the world than I can explain, the old man continued. I've seen anger break men. I've seen kindness save them. When that window broke, I wasn't angry. I was disappointed, not just in you, but in what fear can make a person do. The officer's chest tightened. You thought you were protecting yourself, the old man said. But you were really protecting your fear. The fear that the man in front of you might be different, might be dangerous. You let that fear control your actions. That's what I want you to remember. The officer's eyes burned. I know, sir. I realize that now. I don't know how to make it right. You start by understanding, the old man said. Every time you stop someone, ask yourself if you're reacting to danger or just difference. Once you know the answer, your actions will follow the truth. They sat in silence for a moment. The sound of the wind chimes floated through the open window. Do you know what I used to do for a living? The old man asked suddenly. The officer shook his head. I served as a judge, the old man said quietly. For more than 20 years. The officer's mouth fell open. A judge? Yes, the old man said, smiling softly. I've seen every kind of case you can imagine. I've seen men make mistakes worse than yours, but I've also seen men grow from them. You can't undo the past, son, but you can make it mean something. The officer nodded, overwhelmed. I will, sir. I promise. The old man studied him for a moment, then said, Good. Because my son, your chief, believes in fairness, but I believe in grace. I won't tell you how to do your job. I just ask that you do it with both your head and your heart. The officer smiled faintly for the first time in days. Thank you, sir. I won't forget this. The old man stood and offered his hand. The officer shook it, feeling the strength and warmth in the old man's grip. As he left the house, the sun had started to set, painting the sky in soft orange. For the first time in his career, the young officer didn't feel proud or ashamed, just humble. He understood now that wearing a badge didn't make him powerful. Doing right did. Back at the station, the chief asked how it went. The young officer said quietly, He's the kindest man I've ever met, sir. I don't deserve that kind of forgiveness. The chief nodded slowly. Neither do most of us. But that's what makes it powerful. The following days were busy. The chief held a meeting with the entire department. He didn't name names, but everyone knew what it was about. He stood at the front of the room, speaking plainly. We wear these uniforms to protect and serve, but protection means everyone. Not just the ones who look like us, not just the ones who make us comfortable. Every mistake we make out there shapes how people see all of us. We can't afford to act on fear or pride. We act on respect. The room was quiet. Some nodded. Some looked thoughtful. The young officer sat near the back, listening carefully, his hands folded tight. When the meeting ended, the chief pulled him aside. "My father told me you listened," he said. "He believes you'll do better." "I hope he's right." "He is, sir," the officer said. "I'll prove it." And he did. In the weeks that followed, the young officer began to change how he worked. He spoke to people differently. He asked questions first, acted slower, listened longer. His reports grew more detailed, his tone calmer. The others noticed. Some teased him at first and said he'd gone soft, but he didn't care. He'd rather be soft and right than hard and wrong. One afternoon, the chief visited his father. The old man was in the garden trimming a rose bush. "Looks like you've been busy," the chief said. The old man chuckled. "Flowers don't grow unless you care for them. People are the same." The chief smiled. "He's been doing well, you know." That officer. "He's changed." The old man didn't look surprised. "Good, that means he learned something worth more than punishment." The chief nodded. "I think you taught more in one afternoon than I could in a year." The old man set down his shears and looked at his son. "You taught him too, just by how you handled it. Leadership isn't about shouting. It's about showing." The chief looked thoughtful. "You know, Dad, I used to think strength meant being tough. But watching you handle all this, I think strength looks more like peace." The old man smiled softly. "Peace takes more courage than anger ever will." They stood quietly for a moment, the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Finally, the chief said, "You know, I still feel guilty about what happened to you." The old man shook his head. "Don't. If that moment changed even one heart, it was worth it." The chief looked at him, realizing once again how much wisdom could live in silence. Later that evening, the young officer drove by the same street where it all started. He slowed down as he passed the spot, remembering the glass, the fear, the old man's calm voice. He took a deep breath and smiled faintly. He couldn't undo what happened, but he could make sure it never happened again. That night, the city felt a little quieter, a little kinder. And somewhere inside that small police station, the weight of one mistake had turned into the lesson of a lifetime. The old man nodded slowly. "Of course, sir. It's just here in my coat pocket." He reached carefully, moving with the same steady calmness that marked everything he did. But to the officer, his slow movement seemed like hesitation. The young man's nerves kicked in. "Sir, I said license and registration now." The old man looked up, surprised at the tone. Yes, I'm getting it. My hand just doesn't move as fast as it used to." But the officer's mind was already racing ahead. He saw an old car, slow movement, a window not fully lowered, and his training, filled with warnings and worst-case scenarios, twisted those harmless details into something suspicious. "Roll the window all the way down," he ordered. "I'm trying," the old man said softly. "The handle's been stuck for a while. It doesn't roll all the way." The officer didn't listen. His pulse was high, his thoughts clouded. To him, the situation felt off, and he reacted before thinking. "Step out of the car, sir." The old man sighed gently. "I'm happy to, but let me unlock the—" Before he could finish, the officer leaned closer, impatience burning through his nerves. "I said step out." The old man tried again to push the door open, but it stuck slightly from years of wear. That small pause was enough to snap the officer's restraint. With one quick motion, he hit the butt of his flashlight against the side window. The glass shattered, scattering across the old man's lap like 1,000 small stars. The sound was sharp and shocking in the quiet street. The old man didn't move. His hand stayed on the wheel, his face expressionless. For a long moment, there was no sound but the ticking of the car's turn signal. The officer froze, staring at what he had just done. He had expected resistance, maybe anger, not silence. The old man simply looked down at the broken glass, then up at the young man with eyes that were not angry, only disappointed. "Was that really necessary?" he asked softly. The officer opened his mouth, but no words came out. His heart was pounding now for a different reason. Guilt. Another police car arrived moments later, called in automatically when the first officer reported a non-compliant driver. The second officer, older and calmer, stepped out, took one look at the scene, and frowned deeply. "What happened here?" he asked. The young officer stammered. He wasn't cooperating. Wouldn't roll the window down. The old man said nothing. He just sat there quietly, brushing a few shards of glass from his lap. The senior officer leaned closer. "Sir, are you hurt?" "No," the old man said softly. "Only my car is. Do you know why you were stopped?" The old man nodded once. "Tail light, I assume." "I've been meaning to fix it." Didn't think it'd come to this. Something in his calmness unsettled everyone around him. There was no shouting, no threats. Just quiet grace, even in the face of something unfair. After a short exchange, the senior officer decided to bring the man to the station. "Standard procedure," he said. The young officer didn't protest. He was too shaken. When they arrived at the station, everything seemed routine at first. The old man gave his name, address, and identification card. But when the desk sergeant looked at the ID, his expression changed instantly. His eyes darted to the young officer, then back to the card. "Wait here," he said, and hurried into the back office. The old man sat quietly on the bench, his coat draped neatly over his knees, a small piece of glass still clinging to the fabric. He didn't fidget. He didn't complain. He simply waited, the same way he had learned to wait through everything in life, one with patience. Inside the office, the sergeant made a quick phone call. His voice was low, serious. A few minutes later, he came back out, looking uneasy. "Sir," he said to the old man, "someone's on their way to see you." The young officer frowned. "What's going on?" But no one answered him. 20 minutes later, a black SUV pulled into the lot. The chief of police stepped out. His uniform crisp, his face unreadable. He walked straight past the front desk and into the holding area. The young officer stiffened when he saw him. "Chief, But the chief didn't look at him." He walked directly to the old man. For a brief moment, the room went silent. Then, in a voice that carried more weight than anyone expected, the chief said quietly, "Dad." The young officer's mouth fell open. He looked from one man to the other, realization hitting him all at once. The old man rose slowly, brushing off his coat. His expression didn't change. "Hello, son." The chief took a deep breath. "What happened?" The sergeant started to explain, but the chief raised a hand to stop him. He looked at the shattered glass still stuck to his father's sleeve, the small cut on his wrist. His jaw tightened, but his voice stayed calm. "Did anyone think to ask him his name before bringing him here?" No one answered. The silence was heavy. The chief turned toward the young officer at last. "Do you realize who you just put through this?" The young man swallowed hard, unable to speak. The chief's father placed a gentle hand on his son's arm. "Don't be hard on him," he said quietly. "He was only doing what he thought was right. Maybe too fast, maybe too rough, but he's young. He'll learn." The chief looked at his father, torn between anger and respect. "He broke your window." The old man smiled faintly. "It's just glass. I've had worse breaks in life." The chief exhaled slowly. "You shouldn't have to go through this, Dad." The old man looked around the room, at the young officer, the sergeant, his son, and then said softly, "Maybe I was meant to. Maybe it's not about what happened to me, but what it'll teach everyone who saw it." No one said a word. Even the young officer, red-faced and trembling, looked as if the ground had dropped from under him. The chief finally turned to him. "You're going to take responsibility for this," he said evenly. "Not because he's my father, but because he's a citizen who deserved your respect." The old man gently interrupted. "Let him reflect first. Don't punish him right away. Sometimes reflection changes a man more than punishment ever will." The chief looked at his father for a long moment, then nodded. As the old man was escorted out of the station, the younger officer watched in silence. He wanted to apologize, but the words wouldn't come. All he could do was stand there, hearing his own heartbeat and the echo of the chief's words. "You broke more than a window today." Outside, the evening light had dimmed. The old man's car sat parked near the curb, the shattered window still glinting faintly. The chief stood beside his father as they prepared to leave. "Want me to drive you home?" he asked. The old man smiled softly. "No, son. I'll drive myself. I've been doing it a long time." The chief hesitated, then nodded. "All right. Just promise me you'll call when you get there." "I will," his father said, and with that, he climbed into the car, brushed a few glass pieces off the seat, and started the engine. As he pulled away, the chief watched the car disappear down the road. Quiet, steady, unshaken, and inside the station, The young officer stood staring at the empty bench where the old man had sat, realizing that he had just met the kind of man he'd always hoped to become.